tonight we will be talking about just that. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over to Suzie.
Awesome, thank you very much. Right, let me share my screen. That should be done. I've asked for the thumbs up from Claire, if that's excellent. Let me just minimize you from down the corner, and there we go, then I can see my screen as well. So first off, thank you, Claire, and everyone at Tower Hamlets Cemetery for inviting me to talk to you this evening, and especially about one of my favorite subjects, which, if you know me, is body snatching. Now, I have to confess, when Claire said to me I could talk about anything, it certainly got the brain working, because there's so many great stories to tell about London. But tonight, I decided that I wanted to look at the stories that perhaps don't get told that often. Now, for nearly 100 years, body snatchers plagued our churchyards and stole our dead, all in the name of science. They provided a fresh and steady supply of cadavers to the anatomy schools of London and Edinburgh and everywhere in between. And it was a practice that would only begin to peter out with the passing of the Anatomy Act in 1832. London was a hotspot for both body snatching gangs and for the lonely body snatcher. And although many stories have often been told and shared about this famous city, there's still many more still to be discovered. Oh, let me hang on, technology. There we go. I wanted to start this evening just with a very, very brief introduction as to why there was a shortage of cadavers in the first place for anatomy schools, and why it gave rise to the body snatching phenomenon. Mainly, though, I want to look at a number of body snatching stories, some mainly in passing and others a little bit more in depth, before moving on and looking at a few examples of corruption that occurred in London's graveyards so that body snatching could actually take place. Various preventative methods were also used in the capital to try to dissuade the body snatcher from rifling particular graves. And we'll be having a look at just a few of the stories involving cemetery grounds and the watch. Now, finally, this evening, I want to finish up with just a little bit of light entertainment and share just a few stories that I've come across that have made me smile during my research, to show you that not everybody that was carrying a sack through the streets of Georgian London was on his way to an anatomy school. Now, I just want to warn you, there's just a few images of dissection at the beginning of my talk, just so that you're aware. So let's start this evening just with a very brief overview of why body snatching happened in the first place. What actually caused the demand for cadavers? Now, the number of bodies legally available to the teaching schools and hospitals of England and Scotland in the late 18th century simply wasn't meeting the demand. Only 6 bodies were permitted annually from the gallows, and since the introduction of a new teaching style known as the Paris manner had been introduced into London in 1746 by the surgeon William Hunter, the procurement of cadavers suddenly became a priority. Previously, anatomy lectures had been taught using specimens in jars, and the jar here has got a little bit of Burke's brain in it, or with wax anatomical models, or maybe by having a cadaver that would have been placed centrally on a dissecting table, and the demonstrator would have pointed out key parts of the human body while the surgeon was dictating from his notes. Now, this new teaching style of method, although it's promising students a cadaver of their own to work on, rather than maybe having to rely on body parts that had probably been kept in brine, been reused by countless of students beforehand. Only one flaw in this new teaching method, and that quickly needed to be ironed out, and that was the severe lack of legally available cadavers, and it was about to put a dreadful strain on resources. As early as the 1720s, professional body snatchers were roaming the streets of London, and it wasn't too much after this date that we start to see our first famous cases of body snatching emerging. Now, the first and probably the most famous was carried out by William Hunter, owner of the private anatomy school on Great Windmill Street, in a case that's often referred to as the Irish Giant. It's perhaps better to be remembered as the snatching of the 7'6" or 2.3 metre tall Charles Byrne. Now, Byrne was 22 years of age when he passed away in his lodgings in Cockspur Street in Charing Cross. He knew that his body was coveted by the Hunter brothers, and after begging his friends to promise him that they would bury him in a leaden coffin and then put him far out into the English Channel, he eventually relaxed and slipped away. But his friends didn't keep their word, and instead they were lured by the vast sums of money on offer. Now it's £500 to be exact. It's about £43,000 in today's money. And after Hunter had begged and borrowed this desired amount, the body of Charles Byrne was his. Now, a mock funeral did take place. It's written in Wendy Moore's The Knife Man, the biography of William Hunter. And Byrne's friends, while hiding a dreadful secret, transported a leaden coffin to Margate on the 5th of June. They chartered a boat, rowed out to the sea, and quietly slid his coffin over the side. But Byrne wasn't in the coffin that day. His body was instead at William Hunter's new home in Castle Street, waiting to be dissected. But Burns wasn't the only tall man to have died with the fear of his corpse ending up on the anatomist's table. In 1798, clerk to the Bank of England, William Daniel Jenkins, passed away. Although not as tall as Byrne, he's still considered fairly unusual for his day. And his fear of the body snatchers, however, wouldn't be discovered until some 135 years later, when excavations were being carried out in Covent Garden in 1933. As work was being carried out in the graveyard of St. Christopher le Stocks, a lead coffin was found buried 40 feet deep, and on the coffin there was still a coffin plate, which read, Mr. William Daniel Jenkins died the 24th of March, 1798, aged 31. Now the coffin measured 7'6" in length, and that's the same length as Charles Byrne's skeleton, and had been buried by his friends, and they'd been offered a sum of £200. So it's around £11,000 in today's money. But they had remained true to their word, and the body of this gentleman stayed away from the anatomist's table. But body snatching wasn't all about getting the biggest specimen that you could find. Far from it. A large number of cadavers, if not all of them, were stuffed into sacks, then flung over the shoulders and escorted either to a waiting cart or hamper, or to the nearest medical school. And so the majority of cadavers were the shorter folks from the parish, the mothers, brothers, fathers, and lovers of our ancestors. And in the 19th century London, they were being taken out of the ground at a faster rate than they were being put in it. There was still decent money to be made from your average Joe, however, and as the 18th century drew to a close, a cadaver was averaging around 2 guineas per adult, with children fetching around 6 shillings for the first foot. That's length rather than appendage, and then 9p per inch after that. Around 20 years later, so around 1810, the price for cadavers have been driven up by the demand and the unscrupulous business methods of the borough gang. So an adult cadaver was costing £4 4 shillings, with other cadavers, so those measuring 3 feet or less, being charged by the inch. At the end of the body snatching era, and when the Anatomy Act was passed in 1832, an adult corpse could fetch as much as 16 guineas. Now, 2 years after William Hunter's anatomy school in Great Windmill Street had opened and was offering cadavers for everybody, William Gray was spotted with a box as he walked along King Street, Snowfields, in the London borough of Southwark. A once narrow street, I understand it no longer exists. It was well known to be littered with taverns, and when Pepys was writing his diary, he noted that 12 taverns in total were on this street, although I have seen in my research that there was up to 50 taverns in this street at one point alone. Now, 50 years before our body snatching took place, the streets become a maze of slum alleys, perfect for a resurrection man to wander. Now, the box that Gray was carrying contained the trussed-up cadaver of a fine-limbed female, en route, no doubt, to the nearest medical school. Now, in order to get the body into the box, it had been folded into 3, trussed up like a ham, the Oracle and Public Advertiser described it, with her neck and hams tied together. Hers wasn't the only body to have been treated this way, however, and many cadavers were transported throughout city streets and beyond, all folded up and squashed into boxes or hampers of varying different shapes and sizes. There seems to be no regard taken whatsoever by the body snatchers, and stories of cadavers being found squashed into boxes on the back of coaches on the way to Edinburgh were quite commonplace. Many more cadavers were found tied up in sacks, their feet poking out of the bottom for all to see. There seems to be a glut of cadavers in sacks found on the streets of London during the mid-19th century. Now, for our first few stories this evening, I want to look at two snatchings that both occurred in 1823, and both of which involved the body snatchers getting into some pretty sticky situations, to say the least. The first snatching took place in April of that year and happened in the burial ground attached to the workhouse in Shoe Lane, Holborn, in St Andrew's churchyard, and involves 4 body snatchers who've been regularly visiting the graveyard. Now, as the graveyard of St Andrew's was attached to the workhouse, pauper funerals would have been carried out fairly frequently, and it's said that their pauper burial pit could hold about 100 coffins. And a favourite among the body snatchers, a pauper pit or grave as such as this would have been a prime target. Large numbers of cadavers could be taken in one hit, as it were, from graves or pits such as this, and Shoe Lane would have been especially lucrative. Now, the parish here were aware of attempts that their graveyard was being targeted, and they were trying to thwart the body snatchers in getting their dead. And so they placed an £800 piece of iron sheeting over the top of the pit that required a team of men and a pulley to move it into position. Now, I'm not quite sure how this next bit works, but alongside this were 2 wooden trap doors that were locked with an iron bar and then padlocked into place. Now, this group of 4 body snatchers had their working pattern all figured out. 2 men would stay on watch while the other 2 jumped into the pit and started removing cadavers from the coffins. The fact that the pit was covered with an iron sheet seems to be irrelevant, for not only did they move the sheets, and I have no idea how, I can't find out how, but they also managed to replace the original padlock with a dummy that they'd supplied for themselves for easier access. Now, the parishioners, however, were well aware of the goings-on in the graveyard, and they were determined to put a stop to the body snatchers' antics. So in the early hours of the 13th of April, a few members of the parish had tucked themselves behind some nearby gravestones and were watching as the body snatchers opened up the wooden trapdoor and accessed their burial pit. They watched as 2 of the gang jumped down into the pit with shovels, and they waited patiently until they could hear the soft shoveling of soil. No sooner had the body snatchers got into the first coffin that the watch sprung into action. Running from their hiding place and making a beeline for the trapdoor, the parishioners slammed it shut over the pit and padlocked the body snatchers inside. Now, the body snatchers, who were supposedly keeping watch for episodes such as this, immediately took flight, and although they must have initially thought that they'd made their escape, they were quickly apprehended. The body snatchers trapped in the pit, however, are said to have been locked in the darkness for nearly half an hour before they were released, probably much to their relief, and quite pungent, no doubt, I expect. And they joined their friends in the parish watch house for questioning. Now, our next snatching also happened in the year in 1823, but this time in October, so just at the start of the dissecting season. And it involves 3 members of the notorious, and some may say not very capable, Spitalfields gang. The charge brought against these body snatchers when they were finally caught was stealing 2 cadavers out of the pauper burial ground at St James's in Clerkenwell. This is the same graveyard that a member of the notorious Borough gang, Joseph Naples, you may have heard of him from the Diary of the Resurrectionist, he once worked here as a gravedigger. Now, the snatching style of the Spitalfields gang, let's say, was a little bit unprofessional at times, and it's probably on this occasion that it's the clumsiness of their style that let them down. They were first spotted in the area by some overzealous neighbours, and a house which overlooks the burial ground had once been hired out by resurrection men. One of its windows in the basement had no pane, and instead it had a curtain hung up in its place. I'm unsure as to the exact location of this house. I think it could have been on the notorious Ray Street, which is just off Farringdon Road, where there is one particular house here that is said to have been hired out on a number of occasions over the years to different resurrection men. So I have a feeling it's this one. But the ragged appearance of the house nurtured a suspicion that there could well have been some snatchings going on, and it caused neighbours to keep a vigil over the graveyard. It wasn't long before their efforts were rewarded. Once again, concerned parishioners settled into a suitable position within the graveyard to keep watch on the resurrection men as they went about their business. as the three body snatchers entered the graveyard that October night, the watch sat quietly as the first cadaver was lifted from the grave. They watched as the burial shroud was removed and as the cadaver's legs were tied tight up around its neck, and then they watched as they stuffed it roughly into a sack. As the body snatchers went steadily about their work, they sensed, however, that something wasn't quite right and that they were in fact being watched. Deciding to cut their losses and make a run for it, they threw down their spades and darted towards the nearest exit, their only escape, however, being over the churchyard wall. But the wall of St. James's was a retaining wall, and the drop on the other side was reported to have been 30 feet down. There was only one thing for it, and so the resurrection men scrambled up on top of the wall and jumped. Their landing was soft, but perhaps not one that they'd hoped for alongside the church and the stinking Fleet's ditch, and the three men had just taken a running jump into the filth and then plunged right up to their necks in it. Now, body snatching was so rife in the city that there were some people who'd stop at nothing to protect the graves of not only their loved ones, but also of other members of the parish. In 1817, just as the year's coming to an end, a grave was being dug in the churchyard of St. Martin's in the Field, ready to take the corpse of a 7-foot-tall grenadier who'd recently passed away. Now, as with other giants before him, it's well known that the resurrection men would be after his body. For the anatomists, they would have paid quite handsomely for such a specimen. But being particularly passionate about the inhabitants of his graveyard, the sexton of St. Martin's wanted to make sure that the grenadier was going to be particularly safe and installed a handmade device over the grave. And the contraption was based on the already successful cemetery gun, which in turn had been adapted from a poacher's gun. And essentially, as you can see in the image, it was a gun mounted into the soil with a series of tripwires that would have radiated from the trigger and over the little iron hoops there, and would have been arranged over the grave. The idea behind a cemetery gun was that the unsuspecting body snatcher would come along, trip on the wires that would have been pinned out over the grave, and that in turn would pull the trigger. The reality was that many cemetery guns were dismantled by the body snatchers and then just simply reset when they left the graveyard. Now, such was the fear that the grenadier's body would be taken that the sexton, however, decided to take things one step further. Maybe it's actually be a few steps further, as he decided to tie a number of gun barrels together in the form of a magazine. The contraption was duly installed over the grave. The mouth of the guns was pointing directly over the head end of the coffin, because that's the end that the body snatchers dug down from. The tripwires were all rigged up, but on this occasion, instead of placing the wires around points around the grave, they were wrapped around a piece of wood, which in turn was then buried below the surface of the soil. So the idea was that when the soil was disturbed, the gun would go off. And boy, did it go off. In the early hours of the 30th of December, a tremendous rapport was heard coming from the graveyard. As fast as he could, the sexton made his way to the scene, and when he got there, he was confronted by a whole host of body snatching equipment, sacks, shovels, picks, etc. Laying on the grass, however, was a hat with a single bullet hole inside, showing the sexton that his homemade contraption had indeed worked. Now, the lifeless body of the body snatcher was never found and was thought to have been taken away by his friends that night. Whether he turned upon the dissecting table is a mystery, and one that perhaps will never be solved. But the use of cemetery guns was rare within the parishes of London, and they tended to opted for more traditional methods of securing their securing their dead against the body snatchers. Now, in London, many parishes took up to setting watch within the graveyard, either by employing men specifically for the job or through the use of dedicated parishioners, usually friends, families of the deceased, that type of thing. Now, throughout London, relics can still be found from the body snatching days, and if you know where to look, there's a number of watch houses that can be found throughout the capital. There's 8 watch houses in London, or remnants thereof, that are specifically connected with grave robbing in central London. So we have Rotherhithe, which was once a charity school, and it's now a cafe. We also have Bermondsey Watch House, which on my last visit many years ago, as you can see here in the slide, was being renovated for use as a coffee shop. I understand it's very nice and in that it's now part of the Watch House chain. We also have St Martin's in the Fields, St Olaf's Watch House, St Sepulchre's, Newgate, Shoreditch, and also Lambeth. All its remains of Lambeth is just this little stone that's set in the wall, as in the picture here. Then we have Bethnal Green Watch House, which is probably a bit more familiar to you as it's the one that's nearest to Tower Hamlets area. Now, the watch house was built in 1754, although some sources incorrectly say much later, and it sits on the corner of St Martin's Row and Wood Close, and it hooks the grounds of St Martin's Church, and hasn't really changed much in its 267 years. Following the installation of the watch house, a watch box, which sounds to be a really, really basic affair, was set up in the churchyard in 1792, and the watchmen here were actually given a wage when they were appointed of 10 shillings and 6pence. Now, as an added incentive, and perhaps in the vain hope that the watchman may not become corrupted by the temptations and offer from the body snatcher, a 2-guinea reward was handed over on the apprehension of any grave robber. The more cadavers that were stolen, the more parishioners began to fiercely guard their graveyards. Now, as time went on, there was little improvement, for body snatching was still rife in the area, and the parish thought it necessary to increase the protection around the graveyard. So in 1804, a patrol was set up, acting very much like a security guard would do today, just wandering around the perimeter of the site, keeping note of any unusual activity. Now, this was all very well and good, but there were still bodies being stolen and a decent amount of money was being made. And so it wasn't long before those who were employed to defend the graves of our loved ones were working alongside the resurrection men and helping to pave the way for easy access to the parish dead. The temptation to collude with the body snatchers became too great for some, and in 1821, again in 1826, we find that the grave digger, amongst others, were involved in body snatching cases. Now, such was the stigma and shame attached to a body snatching raid on a churchyard that some sextons would do anything to hide the fact that a body snatcher had targeted the area. Rightly or wrongly, as soon as a raid was discovered, suspicion immediately fell on the sexton or gravedigger and possible collaboration with the body snatchers. In some instances, they were wrong, and in some, as we'll see in a moment, they had every right to be suspicious. But first, let's just turn to one graver in Camden Town in 1823, for whom a visit from the resurrection men was just too painful. In a graveyard regularly targeted by body snatchers, the parish were keen to take precautions to protect their loved ones and to keep them from the anatomist's table. The sexton here was in the habit of placing a cemetery gun over freshly filled graves, a preventative measure that the body snatchers, as we've seen, would simply just dismantle before they started digging up a corpse. But the snatching still rumbled on, and if it hadn't been for the fact that the body snatchers in this case had been discovered walking through the streets of Camden Town, up Holborn Hill to be exact, with a couple of bodies tied in sacks over their shoulders, then we may never have learnt about this tale at all. When the case came to court and it was the sexton's turn to be questioned, the truth eventually came out. He was well aware that the graveyard was being targeted by the resurrection men, and so to protect the graves, he'd set cemetery guns as and when required. From either fear or shame of the acts that were taking place, the sexton openly admitted that he kept the secret to himself. He'd visit the graveyard each morning, and rather than alerting officials as to what was happening, he would replace the cemetery guns properly, rearrange the graves so that they looked like they hadn't been disturbed. Now, to me, this was a simple case of embarrassment and shame. Although the resurrection men were targeting his graveyard, he thought the best mode of action was just simply to remain quiet. Now, one of the better known stories of corruption involves the parish of St Mary's in Lambeth in the year 1817. Now, the parish was plagued with visits from the body snatcher. The parishioners advertised for a permanent watch to undertake during the dissecting season. So that's from October to May. Dissections that would have been carried out at the private anatomy schools during the summer months wouldn't have required as a heavy supply of cadavers, and so parishioners could have watched the graveyard themselves, hopefully during a quieter period. Now they advertised the position, and it was soon filled by two very able-bodied men named Thomas Duffin and William Marshall. St Mary's had been targeted almost nightly by the resurrection men, and so the parishioners were keen for this permanent watch to start. But despite their best efforts and their enthusiasm, the locals still kept disappearing from the graveyard. Even installing man traps across the site was having little effect on the number of cadavers being taken. And so the parishioners, having to suspect that they'd hired a couple of rogues, decided to watch the graveyard themselves one evening. Arranging themselves around the graveyard, what would we do without gravestones? I do not know. They were in clear sight of the new graves. The local watch waited for events to unfold. A little bit of a rhythm going on here. Now, around midnight, the man traps could be heard being dismantled, and the quiet sound of digging commenced. The men waited and watched in astonishment as the two men they'd employed as watchmen were systematically picking the graveyard clean. During the confrontation, one of the watch received several blows with a saber, according to accounts, and it was on this assault, rather than the stealing of dead bodies, that the body snatchers would be tried. Now, both Duffin and Marshall received the same sentence at the Surrey Assizes that August, a 2-year stint in the county jail. To finish up this evening, I just want to share with you two very short tales with you that I find rather amusing and that I found when I first started researching body snatching many years ago. Both stories go to show how heightened people's senses had become to the underhand world of the body snatcher, for as they were concerned, everywhere they turned, they were seeing exhumed corpses. Our first story occurs in the summer months of 1823, when a man was seen walking along Pall Mall, or Piccadilly, it really depends which account you read. He's fairly decently dressed, and yet over his shoulder is a sack. Now, suspicions were raised and a crowd started to follow behind him, growing more and more concerned as to the contents of the sack, and it appeared to give the illusion of a dead body. The gathering crowds hurled abuse at the man, continuing to walk down the street, which only grew worse as what seemed to be a human arm fell out from below the sacking. With the help of the parish watch, the man was escorted to St James's watch house, where interrogations began. And as soon as the watch house doors were shut, the bundle was thrown on the floor and opened. Inside was a human figure, but this one was made of cork and belonged to the man himself, who was a tailor, and this was his dummy, used to model ladies' dresses. And then for our final story this evening, I hope you'll forgive me for travelling to York for this, probably one of the fewest tales that brings a smile to my face. Now, shortly before Christmas in 1828, a box measuring 3 feet in length and 16 inches deep had been placed in the coach house of the Wheatsheaf pub in Castlegate in York, ready to be sent to Edinburgh on the next flyer available. The box was all ready to go, tied up securely with rope and addressed to a Mr. Mackenzie, lecturer of anatomy at the University of Edinburgh. Now, by the time it came to load the box onto the coach for Edinburgh, however, the driver was refusing to take it, suspecting without doubt that the box contained something sinister. Like lightning, word spread around the vicinity that a corpse had been found, and it was unanimously agreed that it should be taken to the Guildhall so that the police may have a look at it. The body was duly placed on a table, and the ropes securing the lid in place were cut. Now, the box did indeed contain meat, but not quite in the form that the parishioners of York were expecting. Inside were 4 cured hams that had been carefully packed and were making their way to Edinburgh for the anatomist's Christmas dinner. And that, swift as it was, brings our little tour around London to a close this evening. And so if you have any questions or even your own body snatching tales, which I would love to hear about, then I'm sure Claire can open things up for discussion. Thank you.